some number of years I've taken an interest in the Truculent Turtle. Some of you may have never heard of it. Others may have forgotten about it because it happened 65 years ago. But it was an epic flight which is well worth recounting. The Truculent Turtle was a Lockheed Neptune P2V1. It was a new design produced towards the end of World War II. It's famous because it flew from Pearce across Australia, across the Pacific, and across America, or a major part of America, and landed at Columbus, Ohio. There was a lot of work to get it through that distance. 55 hours and 17 minutes in the air. The Neptune was designed as a replacement for the Hudson, Ventura and Harpoon. The development dates are a little bit surprising. The initial design went down in 1941. A contract was let to the Navy, to Lockheed to produce the aircraft in February 1944, and the prototype flew in May 1945. That's one of the prototypes there. There were two prototypes produced, and they were used for developmental purposes. The third Neptune off the production line was named the Turtle. The name came from the rivalry between the Navy, US Navy and the US Air Force. The old fable about the tortoise and the hare was bandied around a bit. The Navy was referred to as the Turtle and the Air Force was referred to as the hare. So to keep the joke going, the Navy christened their first operational Neptune the Turtle. Both Lockheed and the Navy and Admiral Nimitz decided there needed to be some promotion for the new aircraft. And so Admiral Nimitz's staff recommended that the flight take place from about as far away as you can get from Washington, DC. If you drilled a hole in the ground at Washington, took it through the centre of the Earth, and on out to the other side, you'd arrive at somewhere near Western Australia. And so Perth was nominated as the origin of this record-breaking flight. The existing record was held by a B-29, and that was from Guam to Washington, DC. And the Navy thought that they should go a little bit better than that, so what they proposed was to fly from Perth to Washington. They weren't quite sure how they were going to go, so they variously nominated destinations. They talked about Seattle, they talked about Mid-America, they talked about Washington, and they even talked about Bermuda as being the destination for this record-breaking flight. And so the Turtle arrived in Perth with its name changed. It became the Truculent Turtle. Truculent means aggressive. So this was the aggressive Navy Turtle arriving in Perth to take on this challenge, to test the aircraft and the crew on this epic flight. The crew, Tom Davies, Eugene Rankin, Walter Reed and Roy Tabley. They had a support aircraft with 7 people on board, all highly trained technicians. It was a Douglas R-5D, which is the Navy version of the military version, which was the C-54, and the civilian version was the DC-4. All of them were referred to as the Skymaster. They arrived in Perth on the 18th of September, and they spent the next few days acclimatising themselves and testing the aircraft, testing the Neptune. Before it got here, all of the armament had been removed, cabin heating and oxygen had been removed, and the anti-icing, de-icing system had been removed as well. Anything that wasn't absolutely necessary for this record-breaking flight was removed from the aircraft. Test flights were carried out in at Perth Airport as we know it now, but in those days it was Guildford Airport. They flew a number of experimental missions. On Tuesday the 24th, they strapped on JATO bottles or rockets to the mid section of the fuselage of the aircraft. Each of these bottles was going to produce 1,000 pounds of thrust, and these were to be activated halfway through the takeoff run to lift the heavy weight off the runway. One of the passengers, to fill the aircraft up a little bit, they didn't fill it up with fuel, they had the part filled, and one of the passengers was Group Captain Colin Hanna, who some of you people would know or would come across. Colin Hanna said afterwards that he went for the ride of his life. They squeezed on board 6,800 gallons, imperial gallons of fuel. During the test flight on the Tuesday the 24th at Perth Airport, when they fired the rockets, there was great consternation because there was so much flame and smoke, fire and noise that people from miles around were concerned about what was going on. Not only the people around, but the officials at the aerodrome. They contemplated what might happen if the aircraft didn't succeed in getting off the ground, because the duty runway pointed towards metropolitan Perth and the city of Perth. So, in a quick discussion, they decided to move the whole business to Pearce Airforce Base. So on the Wednesday, they went to Pearce. They carried out a few tests on the Wednesday and the Thursday, and they were expecting to leave on the Friday. But the forecast was against them. They had to take into account not only the weather in Perth, but the weather across Australia, across the Pacific, and across America. And of course, if any one of those was in a very bad state, then they'd have to consider getting the flight away. So they cancelled the flight on the Friday and moved it up to the Sunday when things looked pretty good. They taxied the aircraft, partly loaded, out to the end of the runway, turned it around, pushed it back as far as they could, and then had the tankers come out and start filling it up. They didn't want to overstress the undercarriage of the aircraft by taxiing it around and about to get to the end of the runway. And they started to squeeze the fuel into it. There was a nose tank that took 585 gallons. The sonar buoy chute at the back where they poked out their surveillance equipment carried 128 gallons. The outer wing tanks, 1,542 gallons. The wing tip tanks, 200 gallons each. The bomb bay, 2,200 gallons. The rear fuselage, 2,082 gallons. And the network of pipes that connected it all together had about 140 gallons in it. It was 13 tonne overweight. So it was a pretty impressive sight as it sat on the end of the runway. Oil, they had 220 gallons in the nose of the aircraft. They had auxiliary tanks, 40 gallons each, adjacent to the engines of the aircraft. In all, 300 gallons, imperial gallons of oil on the aircraft. No twin-engine aircraft had ever lifted that weight when it made its departure from Pearce. So at Pearce Aerodrome, they started their takeoff run. Both at Guildford and Pearce, they had placed markers down the runway at 1,000-foot intervals, and they were testing against their speed, the speed they could pick up throughout their takeoff run. By 3,000 feet, they had achieved 105 knots. Tom Davies had started the engines of the aircraft, advanced them to full power, sat on the brakes. When everything was all right, released the brakes and off they went. So at 3,000 feet, he had really reached his decision point. It was either go or give it away. Some people said that it was fly or die, and others said it was fly or burn. Soon after reaching the 3,000 foot marker, Tom Davies fired the rockets at what they estimated to be 110 knots. They were committed. They had to go. So that's a photo of it, with the rockets blasting. They got away at 6:10 on Sunday, the 29th of September. They're designed for a late takeoff in the day, when the temperature was down, the air density would be better for them, and there'd be less turbulence. So there we are at 110, the rockets were fired. At 4,000 feet down the runway, Tom Davies rotated the aircraft at an estimated speed of 115 knots. He had to wait 1,000 feet for the aircraft to lift off. The end of the runway would have been getting quite close. So the aircraft passed over the end of the runway, established in a climb, not very much incline. Interestingly also, on board for the flight were the 4 crew and a 9-month-old kangaroo donated from the South Perth Zoo to the Washington Zoo. There was also a letter from the Mayor of Perth to the Mayor of Washington. On departing Pearce, they turned, gaining speed and height, towards Hillrees, or what is now Hillrees. And once over the water, they dropped the auxiliary rockets, the J-2 rockets. They reversed the turn, still climbing. They'd already retracted the flap at 125 knots, and they passed over Perth at 3,000 feet, doing about 160 knots. And they set heading for Alice Springs. They had designed to fly the first 500 miles at 3,500 feet, but there was too much turbulence, so they increased that height and sacrificed fuel to climb 6,500 feet. Even then, there was turbulence at 6,500 feet. It was concerning them quite a lot because it was overstressing the airframe. Midnight, Alice Springs passed under their wings, and at dawn they passed Cooktown on the Queensland coast. So, referring that to a map, there was their first dawn at Cooktown, 24 hours in the air by the time they got out to that section of the Pacific. Mid-Pacific, they had another sunrise. This would mean something to some people here who flew double sunrises out of Perth. And after they'd been in the air for 48 hours, they were over America. As they approached America, they radioed their position and their intentions. And their intentions at that stage were Washington, DC. They had to climb to 14,500 feet to get over the Rockies. And unfortunately, what happened was the airframe started to ice up. So with the airframe iced up, they had to apply extra power. The engines weren't performing as well as they should because they were icing up as well. And they ended up using excess fuel throughout that exercise. Once they got over the Rockies, they had to descend to lower than planned altitude to dissipate the ice. And so once again, a sacrifice of fuel. At this stage, they got to thinking that Washington was a little bit too far away, and they had to reduce their aim. And so they had their third sunrise in the air with Chicago to the north. They could see it through the door. So they settled on the Naval Air Station at Columbus, Ohio, where they landed at 1:25 p.m. They had a four-way handshake to celebrate their arrival. They'd had a shave, clean up, got into uniforms before they landed, so they looked pretty smart. There was the crew again, and the kangaroo. I jumped ahead a little bit there, but they were spirited away the next day to Washington, where they were congratulated by the President. And while they were in Ohio, they were given awarded the Distinguished Service Cross each. 10 years later, they had a reunion at Norfolk, Virginia, where the aircraft had been pensioned off after 6 years of service.
Is the kangaroo there?
No, kangaroo had gone to the reserve. In 1977, the Truculent Turtle had its wings removed and it was towed by road to the Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, where it is today. Malio informed me that a year or two ago he was in Pensacola and was very pleased to see it, and has got some photos of it. I've also discovered that today we have one Neptune pilot among us. Any other Neptune pilots among us? Only the one, Rod Stewart. It took 40 years, more than 40 years, for that record to be broken. And this is when Dick Rutan and Miss Yeager flew their specially designed Voyager 40,000 miles. They went around the globe from Edwards Air Force Base to Edwards Air Force Base in 9 days, 3 minutes and 44 seconds, sometimes gliding, sometimes under power. That record still stands. I don't think it'll be broken in a hurry. Interestingly, Captain David Massey Green from Qantas, who used to be an instructor at this Aero Club, holds the record between London and Sydney in a Boeing 747-800. But there are a lot of tricks played with that. I believe the fuel was frozen or nearly frozen before it was put on board, etc., etc. David was a very tricky man, and he would have pulled a few tricks to get that done. Thank you. Any questions?
I noticed the takeoff point at Pearce was next to the explosive dump.
A good pair.
What were the motors on that machine, Brian?
Wright Cyclone, 2800 horsepower, 3350.
Were they turbo compounds?
No turbo. Wait on. Maybe supercharged.
Yeah, exhaust-driven turbine.
I was an apprentice at MMA and I appeared at work one day and there was this aeroplane I'd never seen before in any books or anything out on the ramp there. This was the Truculent Turtle, and the US Navy had just arrived with it, and they used our hangar, our facilities, benches and vices, and borrowed our tools and so forth, and we assisted wherever we could and helped them to prepare the aeroplane. It was there for about a week before they took it to Pearce and made their record-breaking flight. It was very interesting to watch them get it ready, and I believe they they refrigerated the fuel, I don't know to what temperature, before they did their final takeoff.